he did have a sex life, he did have emotions, he did fall in love. It's very disturbing to discover that. But I think one of the things we do with these people is to distance ourselves implicitly from them by calling them names, by saying they're not normal human beings. The fact is, he was relatively normal in most respects.
Welcome to the History Extra Podcast. Fascinating historical conversations from the makers of BBC History Magazine. Why were so many Germans prepared to participate in the terrible crimes of the Third Reich? It's a question that has exercised historians and the wider public for decades. And now, in his new book, Hitler's People, Professor Richard J. Evans seeks to provide an answer. Richard's written a piece on this subject for the November 2024 issue of BBC History Magazine. And for this episode, he spoke more to Rob Attar about the inner lives of Nazi perpetrators.
Your involvement in a BBC TV series recently prompted you to look afresh at Nazi Germany. What did you discover from that looking again?
Well, it was a series I was asked to take part in called Rise of the Nazis, and it focused on individual actors who were represented by a mixture of specialists like myself and lay people who could be thought to be, in some ways, though not always, similar to them. And I, I'm afraid, was representing Hitler, and then we had people representing, Goebbels and Goering and so on. And it was very, very carefully prepared by 72 films made for BBC Two. And what we had to do was to say, well, on the 3rd of May 1933, Hitler would have been feeling this and thinking that and so on. So we had to kind of had these individual perspectives on the rise of the Nazis from the 20s through to the end in 1945. That got me thinking about individuals, and I realized that since I wrote my 3-volume general history of Nazism from 2003 to 2008, it was clear that there had been an enormous amount of additional research. A lot of documents had been published, which wasn't available to me when I wrote my 3 volumes. And in addition, historians, particularly in Germany, have been very wary of biographies, the biographical approach, obviously because under the Third Reich from 1933 to 45, there had been a massive cult of personality, not just Hitler's, but others too. And so German historians in particular were rather wary of focusing on individuals. And that had been changed, I think, round about the turn of the century, just as my 3 volumes were coming out. The charge, as it were, was led by Ian Kershaw's tremendous 2-volume biography of Hitler himself. But there are many, many others. Almost the only leading Nazi who didn't have a full biographical study was Hermann Goering. All the others, I think, had been done with tremendous thoroughness. And in addition, there's a huge wave of what they call perpetrator research, going right down to the basic level of the ordinary mass murderer, as it were, in the concentration camp guard, and a huge wave of studies had appeared. So I thought the time was right to take a fresh look at Nazi Germany through individual perpetrators. So the book, Hitler's People, presents a couple of dozen biographical essays, starting with Hitler himself, but the longest in the book, and then going on through the leading echelons of Goebbels, Goering, Rosenberg, Himmler, and so on, and through kind of instruments of power, but not makers of policy like Heydrich and Eichmann, and then down to just the bottom level of perpetrators, sympathizers, and fellow travelers. So that's what consists of.
As you said there, you begin the book with a portrait of Hitler, and you write in that portrait that he's often described as an enigma. Do you think that's an accurate label for him?
Hitler has very frequently been described as an enigma, a puzzle, a man without qualities almost, who acted as a sort of echo chamber for the German people's wishes and desires, or at least the wishes and desires of a very large segment of the German people. And I plowed my way through massive editions which have appeared in the last 25, 30 years of his writings, of his speeches, all sorts of documents relating directly to him. It wasn't, say, the easiest or most pleasant of occupations. But what came through, and came through from other documents, including those Goebbels diaries, was that, first of all, he was actually, like all the rest of them, a human being. They've all often been described as a gang of criminals or psychopaths or deranged. And I found out there's much more disturbing than that. They are in many ways rather ordinary. Hitler himself had a solid middle class upbringing. There's nothing in it that points to the future dictator or the rabble rousing orator. Nothing, indeed, that points to anti-Semitism, the core of his being, which seems to have occupied him, as it were, and obsessed him from the end of World War I, but not before that. So he's a man who emerges, I think, with significant characteristics which you can trace through his writings, his speeches, his obsessions, his interactions with others. He was, for example, not a man who did not socialize at all. On the contrary, he had a group of close friends, even, and advisors around him through the 1920s into the 30s. These are not necessarily the top Nazis, or they're people like his chauffeur or his valet and so on, but he certainly did need people around him. And all the biographers, including Ian Kershaw, and it's one of the very few points where I disagree with him, and most recently Volker Ulrich, they all say he had no sex life at all. But there have been some fairly recent studies of his medical side, of his health and his sickness. And it emerges from the notebooks of Theo Morell, who was his personal doctor in the later stages of his power, that and Morell kept very, very careful records of all the medication he provided to Hitler in case Hitler died suddenly and Morell, was accused of poisoning him. He took a kind of Viagra consisting of kind of extracts from bull's testicles. It sounds actually revolting, doesn't it? But I mean, he took that before he spent a night with Eva Braun. So, and he did have various affairs before he settled down with Eva Braun. So I think he did have a sex life. He did have emotions. He did fall in love. It's very disturbing to discover that. But I think one of the things we do with these people is to distance ourselves implicitly from them by calling them names, by saying they're not normal human beings. And in every way we possibly can. I suppose the most striking example of that is the brief treatise written on him by Walter C. Langer, the psychiatrist for Roosevelt during the war, where he just picks up all the kind of barroom gossip, fed mostly by an old friend of Hitler's who kind of defected, called Putzi Hunstinger. And that just is all about how he was sexually perverted, how he was maniac, the carpet biting, all of these legends which turn out not to be true at all. But the fact is, he was relatively normal in most respects.
As you said earlier, you've written about several of what you might call Hitler's henchmen, or the leading Nazis underneath him. Did you find many commonalities between these people that might explain how they all became involved in the running of the Third Reich?
Well, it's very striking when you look at their biographies from sort of cradle to grave, that many of them suffered a serious crisis or social downfall at some point in their lives, whether it was their father was arrested and sent to jail, for example, relatively early on in their life, such as was experienced by Robert Attar, the head of the Nazi Labour Front, a huge organization, replaced the trade unions under the Nazis, or Reinhard Heydrich, one of the main architects and main people who carried out, organized and ordered the Holocaust, who was dishonorably discharged from the Navy over an affair with the woman he eventually married, but he sort of chucked his previous girlfriend, who unfortunately for him happened to be the daughter of a well-connected admiral. And so he was dishonorably discharged when the admiral complained, as it were, to a so-called court of honor. And there are many, many others like that. And Hitler was, of course, one of them. He had a comfortable middle-class upbringing as the son of a customs official in Austria, as it happened. And he then had no intention of getting a regular job, as his father wanted, but tried to get into the Austrian Academy of Arts and was rejected. He couldn't draw people, maybe significant there, but he could draw buildings. He didn't accept this. He always thought of himself as an artist, latterly in politics, I think. And he drifted, lived on a very small legacy, and at one point was living virtually on the streets in a men's hostel because he couldn't afford to rent a proper apartment. So that was a decline. And Hill was able to link all of this sort of social decline, with a narrative about national decline. In 1918, with the defeat of Germany and Austria in World War I, he was able to link that and say, look, the whole country has experienced this terrible downfall, this dreadful crisis, the collapse of the empire in both those cases, massive defeat in the war, Treaty of Versailles, reparations imposed by the Allies, loss of territory, a ban on combat aircraft, and a ban on Navy vessels. I mean, 13% of the territory of Germany was taken away and given to other countries. So all of this he presented as a terrible calamity, in which resonated with people, in particular those who'd suffered a personal crisis. And that, of course, happened then in the Weimar Republic because of the massive inflation in the early part of the Republic, and then the huge depression in the later part of the Republic.
You also make the point in the book that many of the kind of leading Nazis had actually been there since almost the beginning. How are these people able to stay at the top for so long? Because it seems quite different from a number of other dictatorships, such as, say, the Soviet Union.
Soviet Union was completely different, and that's because Stalin, who became dictator at the beginning of the 1930s and carried on until the early 50s, he had emerged out of a kind of collective leadership, particularly following the death of the essential founder of Communist Soviet Union, Lenin, and there's a whole row of more or less equal people at the top: Zinoviev, Kamenev, of course, Trotsky above all. And Stalin was not somebody who dominated them until he effectively got rid of them, because they were all rivals. Hence the purges, the show trials, and all of those things by which he established himself as a supreme sole leader of the Soviet Union. Hitler was the boss. He was the leader from the very beginning. He never had any rivals except before he established himself as the leader of the Nazi party right in the early 1920s. There were no rivals at all. Goering, Goebbels, Himmler, they all accepted his leadership. And so one of his criteria, of course, for retaining people was not so much competence and ability as loyalty. He demanded absolute loyalty, and he got it from his people who worked under him and occupied the top positions. There are one or two exceptions. So Ernst Röhm, for example, whom I deal with in my book, is a fantastic relatively recent biography by Eleanor Hancock. And Röhm was perceived, particularly by the army, as a potential rival. There were 2 million stormtroopers who Röhm led in the early 1930s. So the army pressured Hitler to get rid of him. There were some who came in relatively late to the Nazi leadership, like Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, who eventually became Minister of Munitions. But the core leadership group stayed with him a very long time, and that's a huge contrast to Stalin.
Beyond the top leaders, your book then looks at what you might call lower level functionaries. Some of them are not even necessarily ideological Nazis. Why do you think these people are still prepared to acquiesce in and even aid many of the Third Reich's worst crimes?
Well, first of all, of course, many of them were Nazis. The pressure under the Third Reich itself, once Hitler established power, on people to conform ideologically was just enormous. You have to remember the massive cult of personality surrounding Hitler. You were supposed, compelled indeed, under the Third Reich, to greet everybody on the street or in a letter or communication with the words Heil Hitler, not good morning or hello. So Hitler was kind of omnipresent, and the cult of Hitler was just absolutely enormous, and the pressure was huge. And then there's what the historians use the Nazi word Gleichschaltung, which is a kind of an electronic metaphor. It's the Nazi leadership throws a switch and all the electrical devices change. They all the lights come on or go out or whatever it might be. And that meant that every institution, bar the church, and including even later on the army, it took a long time, every institution was Nazified. Your local choir, your local football club, all of that became part of the Nazi apparatus. The whole cultural apparatus, orchestras, art galleries, literature, everything was taken over by the Nazis. So the pressures on ideological conformity were huge. There were some people like Heydrich, for example, only came under that pressure relatively late, but it was also the key to having a career under the Nazis. And so there were lots of inducements to conform. And even where people didn't, and I have an example of a relatively little known military man, of Army Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, who was not exceptional in any way, but he didn't approve of some of the actions of the Nazis, particularly the SS, and their massacres of Jews during the war. Nevertheless, he decided there's nothing much he could do about it, just better carry on. And although he, talked about the moral perversity of the yes, but he never did anything. So the structures of power are all behind the regime. These inducements included for Leib the gift of a large estate in Bavaria, for example, to kind of keep him quiet. He was very grateful that Hitler personally made this a gift. And there are lots of effectively bribery of a lot of leading people. So the material rewards of playing a leadership role in the Third Reich were huge. And of course, there was massive corruption because there's no independent police or independent newspapers or media to act as a check on corruption in Nazi Germany. And then much lower down, you can find, again, kind of what I call ordinary mass murderers. And ideology plays a really important role there. And you can see how in some of them, they imbibe certain aspects of the Nazi creed, and then they transition from just believing these things to actually shooting people, particularly Jews, is all too easy. And that's one of the most frightening things of the whole Third Reich, the whole Nazi story. Anti-Semitism, which emerges from my book even more strongly than it has, I think, in other studies, was the absolute core of Nazi belief. And it was internalized by a lot of the people who worked for the Nazis. And finally, I think you have to remember, on the contrary, that the Nazis only ever won just over a third of the votes in a free election in the two elections of 1932. Most Germans were not fully paid up fanatical Nazis, despite the massive impact of the media, the Nazi-controlled media in the 1930s and early 40s. And I include one or two chapters on people who were not fully paid up Nazis, but still went along with it all because the costs of opposing Nazism became increasingly dire for people, as we have the studies of resistance and dissent have shown.
And as you mentioned earlier, the people you're writing about are not monsters, they're not aberrant, they're not just gangsters. So is it really the conditions around them of the Nazi state that makes people who before the war may have done nothing like this prepared to participate in genocide?
Well, to say something like that, which I agree with, does not absolve them from personal responsibility at all. To say that the whole Nazi Third Reich was a whole system which imposed ideological conformity, ultimately in the end by terror and a threat of violence. To say that doesn't absolve people of responsibility, and it was not simply. It was never true that people, as they often said after the war, well, I was only obeying orders, I'd have been shot if I didn't. That's not true. There are many examples from the war itself of individuals who refused, for example, to shoot Jews, who refused to take part in massacres, and who did not suffer the consequences of that at all. They were not shot, they were not arrested, they were not imprisoned. They simply were kind of led off to do something else, as it were. So you could refuse to obey orders and get away with it, but of course the pressures to obey orders were very strong. If all your co-soldiers and fellow men in a military unit were going to take part in a massacre of Jews, there were lots of pressures, such as being loyal to your comrades, being in a difficult situation in a godforsaken place on behind the Eastern Front. All of these things, I think, compounded the whole pressure, the ideological pressure to engage in atrocities. Some brave people did not, and they showed, I think, that you could do that and get away with it.
There's also a point too, isn't there, that people didn't know what was happening. There were some people after all who claimed ignorance, but actually it was very hard not to know anything about the atrocities that were going on, even if you didn't know all the details.
Well, virtually all Germans claimed ignorance after the end of the war, but that was not very plausible at all. What was going on behind the Eastern Front in particular, the ghettos, the camps, the massacres, the shooting of Jews into pits, the gas chambers, all of that was well known in Germany itself relatively quickly in 1942. Soldiers on leave came back with stories of atrocities they'd seen or even taken part in. There were letters from the front, which of course were censored, but you couldn't censor them all, the millions of them. There were examples of people's diaries that showed an awareness of the atrocities committed against the Jews on and behind the Eastern Front very soon, by the spring of 1942. You find, for example, Victor Klemperer, who was a Jewish professor who managed to survive in Germany because his wife was not Jewish and their daughter was brought up as a Christian. He was discriminated against, but he wasn't taken away and killed. And he kept these wonderful, voluminous, very detailed diaries that shows he knew by the spring of 1942. By the end of 1942, the Allies were declaring publicly that the crimes of the Nazis behind the Eastern Front would be avenged.
Now, many of the people you write about, the majority of them are men. Does that tell us something about the kind of masculine or macho nature of Nazi Germany?
Yes, this was one of the most male supremacist regimes in history. Men ruled the world. It was men's job to fight. Men only were in politics, according to the Nazis, because they had the qualities needed to rule the country. I do include some women because there were women who played an important role in the Nazi regime. There's a so-called Reich women's leader, Gertrud Scholz-Klimke, who didn't have any real power, but certainly administered a whole raft of women's organizations in Nazi Germany. Women kept the vote, of course. Women got the vote in the Weimar Republic at the end of World War I, and they kept it under Nazism, though it didn't mean a huge amount because the elections and votes were all rigged. And that's how Hitler managed to get 99% of the population, the adult population, voting for him, because there was a lot of intimidation there. And we don't really know which of his policies were popular and which weren't, at least not from that. So I do include some women. Concentration camp guard, Irma Gräser, the wife of a camp commandant, Ilse Koch. And it's very interesting how they attracted an enormous amount of obloquy, fantasy even, and this depiction as absolute monsters. A lot of it made up after the war because it was felt that they'd violated normal norms of female behavior in the Third Reich. More precisely, there were more female perpetrators than those two, but nobody actually incurred such demonization as they did. There were camp guards, female camp guards. There was a concentration camp for women of Ravensbrück, and there were others who kind of randomly shot prisoners and this kind of thing, but not who perpetrated the bizarre and often sexualized crimes in the reporting of the actions of Koch and Krese.
Now, we know that after the war, most of the senior Nazi leadership were tried for their crimes or had already died or killed themselves. What was the fate of some of the lower level people that you wrote about?
Some of them went underground, changed their name, got a job, so on, and survived for quite a few years until justice system of the Federal Republic, and to a degree East Germany too, caught up with them. Some, like Eichmann, managed to flee through a kind of escape network to Argentina, where the dictator Perón was looking for people with expertise of one sort and another. Not expertise in killing, but other kinds of less harmful expertise. Some of them were imprisoned, though a lot of those were let off as the Cold War gathered pace, and the Americans in particular didn't want to discourage West Germans from supporting NATO by persecuting people. Trials of former Nazis were quite unpopular in post-war West Germany. It was felt it was a kind of revenge of the Allies, quite unfairly, I think. So all in all, there's a whole variety of behaviors, but relatively little was done overall to follow up and prosecute perpetrators at a lower level. Too many of them, I think, got off more or less scot-free. And of course, the West Germany needed to employ professionals, doctors, lawyers, and so on, virtually all of whom, had been involved in the crimes of the Nazis. There was a lot of reasons why perpetrators were not followed up after the war. But you have to say as well, Nazism did not revive, other than on the fringes of politics. There's no new Nazi movement. There's no powerful or even significant wave of nostalgia or support for Hitler once he had killed himself on April the 30th, 1945. Then the support for Nazism ebbed away relatively quickly. And then, of course, in the 1950s and 60s, the so-called economic miracle showed that democracy could be compatible with prosperity, as the Weimar Republic had failed to do.
So when these people were freed of the apparatus of the Third Reich and also the kind of ideological pressure, did many of them show remorse for what they'd done?
That's interesting. No, they didn't. I mean, I used the example of Karl Brandt, who was a skilled and prominent surgeon who got, actually by accident to begin with, got into the higher echelons of the Nazi leadership and ended up by running the campaign, the Action T4 it was called, or so-called euthanasia, or the mass killing of anything up to 200,000 mentally ill and handicapped people. He showed absolutely no remorse. He thought he was on the scaffold. He was condemned to death for his crimes by an American military court in Germany. And even on the scaffold, he was protesting that he'd only ever wanted to do good and to improve the human race by eliminating these people. And in fact, the executioner got fed up with this and just popped a black sack over his head and pulled the lever to shut him up mid-sentence. There's very little remorse on the part of all these people. It's rather disturbing.
What do you put that down to? Because the pressures they'd had been under clearly weren't there anymore. Why did people still not realise what they'd been part of, or not accept how terrible it was?
I think it's important to realise that the Nazis was a movement of young people. Hitler's born in 1889, in his 50s when he's killed himself. Himmler was born in 1900. So he was a young man. They're all very, very young, and Nazism has such a powerful impact on their beliefs, partly because they are still at a relatively impressionable age, and even more so perhaps because it chimes in with their beliefs, with the beliefs of the milieu from which they emerge. You don't find a single former communist or former social democrat or even former liberal in the Nazi perpetrator cohort. They all come from conservative, right-wing nationalist backgrounds. And so the overlap between that sort of conventional mainstream conservatism and the Nazis, who are in fact a far more revolutionary force than, say, the German Nationalist Party, the overlap was quite considerable. And of course, for them, the Nazi regime was a kind of episode of mostly of glory until it came to a sticky end in the last couple of years of the war. So they remember the good times and not the bad times.